This is the Surly Grognards for March 5th, 2012. We're back! This is Peter Bowman.
Hello.
I'm joined here by my co-host and good friend Eric Carlson. How are you doing tonight, Eric?
I'm doing well.
Awesome. So,
Or good. I'm sorry, I'm doing good. I don't want to sound all highfalutin or nothing.
of course not. So tonight we're going to be talking about generic, otherwise known as, or also known as universal RPG systems versus RPG systems designed for a specific setting. Eric and I here both played a few of each type over the years, and we'll be talking about what each type of system is, what their strengths and weaknesses are, and our general thoughts on them. If we have time at the end of the show, we'll of course be taking questions. So you can either email us to our new swanky email address, surlygrognards@yahoo.com, or you can ask them in the chat here if you're watching us live. So, why don't we start off with talking about what a universal system is? So, I mean, it's a fairly straightforward question. What is a universal role-playing game system? It's a system that's designed to be able to run basically any game.
Anything from, like, gritty film noir to space opera to traditional, like, sword and sorcery stuff.
Yep. So we've got things like, so like the classic one, the one that a lot of people know about, is GURPS, the Generic Universal Role-Playing System. The universal is right there in the title, as is generic, which is another term that a lot of people use for this sort of thing. But I like using universal better because I think it encapsulates what actually a universal system is better than generic.
Generic tends to have a certain stigma attached to it also.
Yeah, also you can sort of confuse it with something like 4th edition Dungeons & Dragons, which is a generic fantasy game. Well, not really, but we'll touch on that later. As opposed to something that actually covers a whole bunch of different types of games. So that's sort of what a universal system is. It's a system that's designed to be able to play different genres and styles of campaign. And there are several out there, as I mentioned. There's GURPS is a classic one that everyone knows about. A lot of people know about Hero System.
Yep.
There's an old one that some people know about called Fudge.
Which I had completely forgotten existed until we talked about this the other day.
Yeah, it's not that well known, but it's one of the early ones. Of course, on the other hand, after we talk about universal systems, we have then the setting-specific ones. Things like, Shadowrun's a great example.
The Fantasy Flight 40K games like Dark Heresy, Rogue Trader, Deathwatch, and the like.
Right, Warhammer Fantasy Battle Roleplay. I mean, we could go things like Amber Diceless.
Yep.
Yeah, there's tons of them out there. The original Doomtown.
Yep.
That's less so now since it's tied into a universal system. Yeah, but I mean, there are tons of them. You think about them. Yeah, D&D is an interesting question, Kazi. Kazi in the chat asked whether D&D would fall into this.
Yes. Here's the thing. That what we're talking about is more of a grayscale than black and white. D&D falls pretty flatly in the middle.
Yeah, kind of. I mean, basically, when we talk about
Deadlands, that was the game system.
Deadlands, that's not Doomtown. Thank you. I got a copy of it on my shelf behind me somewhere, but the new one, unfortunately. So, but yeah, like GURPS is at one end of the scale, and say Amber Diceless is at the other end. I mean,
when we talk about a specific system, we mean a game system has rules specifically designed to encapsulate something in that game world. Like, you can't adapt Shadowrun to another world. You can try, I have, but certain things just don't translate well.
Right, and things like, I guess, I mean, given the nature of Amber, for instance, you can sort of run other things in it. I've thought about it.
Right. The thing with Amber is that Amber's a great game that you can play anything, but you're playing in the Amber universe.
Yeah. God, what was it I thought about using the Amber system for? I forget. But anyways. Oh, I remember now. Oh, God. I had it was one of those I had woke up in the middle of the night with a strange idea, but I'll touch on this later, some other time. But at any rate, so yeah, we've got so those are sort of the two sort of camps that most systems fall into, and they usually fall into sort of, as Eric said, a sort of a gray scale, between sort of the one end of true universal systems, which I say the epitome of that is pretty much Hero System. GURPS is not quite as you can do anything in it as Hero is, but it's pretty close. To all the way to the other end of the scale with systems that are really, really genre specific.
Mm.
And there are things to recommend both types of game. We can start. I think we'll start off talking about sort of the strengths and weaknesses of universal systems. I mean, so let's start with that. So I think the primary and most glaringly obvious strength of a universal system is you can play anything.
Right, and you can switch. Say you're sick of your sword and sorcerer game, you can just switch to space opera without even having to bother changing systems.
Right, which means you don't have to learn a lot of new nuances here and there. There'll be small changes here and there depending on which sort of I guess plugins you could say you're using.
Yeah, largely it's skill groups I've found.
Right. Of course, the first most glaringly obvious weakness of a universal system is that you can play anything.
Which means you inevitably have the guy that wants to play the half-vampire space dragon in your gritty film noir game.
Well, there's that. There's also the fact that because it's intended to be incredibly flexible, it's also often very complex.
Yes.
I mean,
like just try explaining Hero System to a bunch of people unfamiliar with it. I know Peter has.
No, it's worse yet. Try to explain Hero System to someone who has never played an RPG before.
Oh God, I don't know.
That is an interesting experience, and not one I actually really enjoyed. I mean, hell, explain to someone who's sort of relatively new to RPGs is bad enough.
Poor Hannah when we tried to explain it to her.
Well, honestly, I think she was sort of getting it until. The problem is that with a system as complex as Hero, you really want to introduce it in small chunks at a time, which is what I was trying to do. But one of the other players who's also familiar with Hero kept lumping in more stuff on top of that, which was unfortunate. It happens. I mean, that's just sort of things like that happen, and I think I'm better at teaching RPGs than a lot of people are. I don't know, but
I'm a terrible teacher. I know this for a fact.
Yeah, well, you and Chris seemed to pick it up pretty well. It took a little while, but
Once I grasped the basic mechanics, I started figuring things out much better, and a lot of that just comes from playing a bunch of different systems.
Right, exactly. So if you actually have a lot of experience with RPG systems, the variety and complexity of a Hero System or a GURPS isn't that daunting. The problem is...
It's actually kind of refreshing in some ways.
Well, true, but the problem is that at that point, the whole sort of you only have to learn one system thing is less,
count.
Less of a strength.
Which is why I tend to, if you're going to go with a universal system with inexperienced gamers, I tend to go with GURPS because it's a much simpler game system.
Yeah, the basic form of GURPS, if you ignore the advanced combat, is actually simpler than Hero System.
Yeah.
The second you start introducing the advanced combat rules in GURPS, that
Which
changes.
I've never played
Oh yeah, that's because I hate the advanced combat rules and I don't use them because there's a freaking flowchart.
Fun.
Oh my god, it's insane.
I stopped playing Rollmaster for that reason.
So yeah, I mean that's the other problem is that because you can do anything and because it's universal, you do lose some focus on of rules that tie into the game world. So like the mechanics don't necessarily reflect the way the universe works all the time, or they don't reflect them as perfectly.
Right.
As they might in a game where the mechanics are designed to actually replicate what you're trying to accomplish in the game.
Meanwhile, systems like Cyberpunk and Shadowrun are laser focused on their particular genre
Right.
and represent these very, very well, but don't translate well into a sword and sorcery or even high space opera.
Yeah. So yeah, I'd say basically my personal take on sort of the strengths, the big strengths of, but there are other strengths in most universal systems. Sorry, systems beyond the fact that you can do anything. Honestly, one of the strengths of both GURPS and Hero System is that while they're complex, they're mathematically and mechanically very, very solid. Now, given that they're universal and they're really flexible, you can cheese out and you can build brokenly powerful characters, and it requires the game master to keep an eye on that. But other than that, because they're both point-based games, while there's not going to be perfect balance between the characters, there is always opportunity for characters to be equal because you have points and you can spend them on what you want to spend them on, as opposed to saying, I want to play a fighter, and let's say you're playing 3rd edition Dungeons and Dragons, and someone says, I want to play a fighter, and someone says, I want to play a cleric. And for the first 2 levels, this is fine, but then things get a little bit out of whack later, as the cleric gets much, much better, and the fighter sort of, goes along at his linear pace. At any rate, but that's not that huge a point. That's sort of getting away from my point, which is that a lot of the generic systems out there, the universal systems, are really, really well designed mechanically. Now, I don't know. I'm not sure this is actually a sort of something that's actually tied into the fact they're universal systems, but it seems to happen more often than not. And I'm not sure. I guess it might be the fact that since you're not focusing on a specific game world, you're focusing more on actually making sure the mechanics work.
I think a lot of that comes down to because they're so flexible, they require a lot more playtesting.
There's that too.
Which means they're a real pain to actually develop. But we don't worry about that because we just buy the games.
Yeah, I don't write them. So, I mean, those are the sort of, so the mechanics are usually very good. You can design anything you want to. You can run any game world you want to. Asterisk, mostly. I mean, there are a few things that some systems don't do. We'll touch on it a little bit more later, but like even the most universal of universal systems has things it doesn't do particularly well. But from there, I think we can sort of start talking about the strengths and weaknesses of games that are designed for a specific world. So we'll take a great example of, say, Shadowrun, because that's one Eric's most familiar with. I've played it a little bit.
I played a lot of Shadowrun.
So, Eric, what would you say sort of the greatest strength of a game like Shadowrun is?
Probably the greatest strength of a game like Shadowrun is that it does what it does really well. It does. For those that don't know, Shadowrun is very much sort of a cyberpunk world. Think like the Matrix or whatnot. For those unfamiliar with that term, type of world. And with cyber tech and sort of the gritty, think less Matrix, think more Blade Runner.
Yeah, I was about to say.
Yeah. But at the same time, you've also got magic. Basically, the idea is magic's to turn the world, and you've got like orcs and trolls and elves running around with cameras glued to their foreheads and assault rifles. So. And the big advantage of that is it meshes these two seemingly like irredeemable aspects of the world together really well and really intelligently. So, and sorry.
So basically,
it's not something that I'm sorry. It's not something I've seen done well. I've seen it attempt to be replicated in a generic system, but never as well.
Right. So you've got that. I mean, and the other big thing is that, as I sort of alluded to when I was talking about some of the minor weaknesses that generic systems have, is the fact that you have the opportunity of, in a specific system designed for a specific world, to take the actual mechanics of the game and tie them into the actual game world.
Yes, and without getting into the minutia of the game system, there are consequences for mixing magic and technology ad hoc.
Right. You know, you got things like that. You've got the way the universe responds to mages in White Wolf Mage.
Mm.
You've got the way, you know, the entirety of the way the Ember Diceless game works is tied entirely into the fact that, you know, you're playing an Amberite. Therefore, the universe sort of bows to your whim.
You've got the whole madness versus occult lore in Call of Cthulhu, for example.
Right. Yeah,
where the more you know about what's going on, the less sane you are, and that's directly tied to the game world.
Right. Yeah, exactly. So you've got things like that, and it's a wonderful opportunity to do something really interesting with it. And some systems take really great advantage of that, and some don't. But you know, that's a potential strength of the specific system. I'd say that there's also the fact that since the specific system and is tied to the game world, you can, in theory, have this wonderful. As Kazi says, Call of Cthulhu, I will be the illiterate that has a phobia of the occult. You're more likely to survive.
You are. You'll make it.
But where's the fun in that? But at any rate,
to play the planned Scooby-Doo Call of Cthulhu game.
That'd be kind of interesting. But yeah, but from there you have, you know, other possible little strengths you've got are, you know, the ability for you to take a game world and basically you have opportunities to have you have the opportunities to have the characters balance appropriately with each other, and not necessarily in terms of raw power. And depending on how you integrate that into the game world, that'll work brilliantly. One of my favorite examples of this is an old game which is still available, being published by Atlas Games, called Ars Magica, which is another classic example of a system-specific world. It's a game where it's about wizards in medieval Europe. You know, what if magic actually worked during this time period? And there's all these wonderful little details of how magic works in relation to actual faith in God versus, you know, the powers of, you know, the underworld and such. But the thing is that basically the game is built around the mages, because that's the point. And mages are absurdly powerful. And below that, there are what are called companions, who are people who hang around with mages. They're the mages' friends, the mages' allies. And they are noticeably less powerful than actual wizards. And then below that are what are called the Grogs, who are basically the schmucko mercenaries who, you know, defended the mages' tower and such, and travel with the mages when they're going from place to place to protect them from, you know, local ruffians and such.
I was going to stop you for a second. Is there anyone else catching weird reverb from Peter there?
Oh, I'm going robo. Hang on 1 second. I'll be right back. Am I sounding better?
You were sounding better to me. Apparently, Kazi was not getting
Okay, well, it might have been on your end. I don't know. I just reestablished the call. That usually fixes things. At any rate, so you have this. So you've got these three tiers of characters between the mage, the companion, and the grogs that are all that, you know, each tier is significantly more powerful, like right from the get-go, than the others. Here's the kicker: every player has a mage. Every player has a couple of companions, and there's the grogs are designed to be sort of a group of a bunch of them that players divvy up amongst themselves as they see fit during adventures. And what happens is most adventures are you know, one player plays his mage, two players play that mage's companions, and the grogs are then divvied up amongst the rest of the players. And you go off and do that mage's story for that session. The next session, someone else's mage's story, and you do that with his companions, which are played by two other players, and the grogs are divvied up amongst the other players, and so on. It's referred to what's called a troop style game. Hang on one second, the phone is ringing. God damn it.
Well, this is certainly sounding professional today. But having never played Ars Magica, I've heard a lot about it, and there's always someone that wants to run a game in this sort of style, and well, I've never had it work out properly, and that it usually never goes beyond the drawing board stage. And
I'm back.
You're back. Excellent.
Yeah, I've played Ars Magica, and it works brilliantly, actually, when you get it off the ground. It is a metric ton of work, though.
Yeah, for all people involved.
Yeah, well, yeah. Well, that's the thing, is one of the things that actually really helps in a sort of in a troop-style game is that you take turns sharing the burden of being the storyteller. That helps a lot. But, at any rate, I was just mentioning that as a good example of doing something interesting and different with character balance because you're tying it into the game, to a specific game world.
And it's actually an excellent example that I did not think of.
Or you've got the classic example of Amber, where the characters are all absurdly powerful, but that's because that's the way the game world works, and so on. And so it's a strength that allows you to explore different things that you couldn't really do in a universal system, because it would throw the game balance completely out of whack, and that matters when you're actually designing something that can go between different genres.
The opposite example of the absurd power level, it would be Call of Cthulhu. Everything will kill you by accident.
Right.
And probably drive you insane in the process.
Yeah, and that's something that actually you can do fairly well in a universal system. I mean, you could easily run Call of Cthulhu in almost any universal system fairly well. I mean, honestly, I'd almost rather run the Call of Cthulhu style game in GURPS and just steal the sanity system and be done with it, rather than use the actual...
You could do that, but you have to build everyone as 50-point characters.
And the problem is?
Just saying.
It's an option in GURPS. That's one of the... Honestly, you might even build them as 25-point characters. That's the thing about GURPS is that you have a number of points to allocate to your character stats, and they have different power levels depending on how powerful the party is supposed to be. And, your default average adventuring, I'm actually a skilled adventurer, is 100 points. 50 points is a skilled normal. So, things like that. Your average schmucko person is, I think, 0 points.
Meanwhile, in the other problem of a specific system is that game balance is not always the best.
Yeah. Because as you were saying, I mean, to put my spin on this, the impression I get is that a lot of people who design specific game world systems focus mostly on creating the way the world works within the rules, and aren't really thinking so much about the implications of this in terms of how the game plays.
Or at the very least, it's not as high priority as in a universal system where it's the only priority.
Right.
Which another burden of a universal system places everything, the entire world on the game master's shoulders, because it's his world. And while in a specific system, there's typically gobs and gobs of information that helps flesh out the world, if not specifically in the rule book, then in all sorts of other resources that would be available. And the players can actually go forth and research this stuff themselves, as long as it ties into their character, or even if it doesn't, if they're good at the whole player knowledge thing.
Right.
But another example, going back to Shadowrun, magic has always been a problem in Shadowrun, and it's always vastly more powerful than everything else. You pay for it at creation, but soon enough along the lines, your major shaman is just going to be, well, your crutch, which I found is a problem with most versions of Dungeons and Dragons as well.
Yeah.
But magic is a problem. Fuck magic.
Yeah, it's the other problems, like, the classic problem of how do you handle telepathy. But this is a problem that applies to every game out there. because telepathy is a problem not so much with a system, but the problem is if you can read minds, boy, this can wreck campaigns. It doesn't matter what the system is. If you can read the bad guy's mind,
Well, that's why all bad guys have Magneto helmets.
and that gets really tiresome and stops being believable after a certain point. But that's sort of getting a little bit off topic, I think. But yeah, so so can you think of any other sort of any other weaknesses of the specific system, Eric?
They don't adapt well. Say you're in love with a specific specialized system, and you want to try something new and zany with it. It's not adaptable. It would be like razor blades are really good for cutting things, but don't ever try to use them as a hammer.
Right, exactly. Whereas, honestly, if you look at Hero or GURPS, they're sort of the Leatherman tool of RPGs.
Right. You're not gonna get as clean a cut with a Leatherman's knife as you will with a razor, but you can do a little bit of everything with it.
Yeah. But you also have pliers.
Yes.
And a screwdriver. And an Allen wrench. I mean. So I mean that is actually, again, that's one of the classic weaknesses, is that it may do the one thing well, but it only does that one thing.
Right. But typically WoW doesn't do that one thing really well, which is why I typically enjoy a specific system or a specific world. I mean, unless of course that specific system was written by FASA, looking at you, Mech Warrior.
FASA. Or early versions of Shadowrun, for that matter.
Which were FASA.
That's my point. Oh, but yeah, so that sort of goes over sort of the the strengths and weaknesses aspect, I think, fairly well. So going from there, we can sort of talk. I think we should talk a little bit about some of the very specific and generic systems we've played and what we think about them. As I mentioned, we talked a little bit about. I've talked a fair bit about GURPS and Hero System. Those are sort of the two big universal systems that I think both of us have played. I've played a couple other ones, but I don't really know them as well as those two, and they honestly aren't as good in my opinion.
I've just played GURPS and Heroes,
right.
Honestly. I forgot Fudge existed.
Right.
Which tells you everything you need to know about my experience with Fudge.
Yep.
Meanwhile, I've played a bunch of specific systems. The aforementioned Dark Heresy, I was in a fairly long-running campaign like that until it ended, because we intended it to end, not because it fell apart.
Right.
The story came to a logical conclusion.
Right.
Is what it was, and I was dead at the time. So.
Yeah, I played a lot of both GURPS and Hero System. I really like universal systems. I think part of that is I like the flexibility. I like the opportunity to build what I want to build when I want to build it. I like the fact that I know the games are sound mechanically.
But at the same time, there are specific things in a specialized system that you don't replicate well in GURPS.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Example, Vampire the Masquerade, showing my age. The whole humanity system and the moral choices there doesn't translate well into GURPS.
There was GURPS Vampire the Masquerade, and it was
bad.
Yeah, it was not one of GURPS' better efforts. But yeah, there's of course that's the thing. But I mean, like honestly, I think what is probably the classic example of Peter and Eric don't always agree on things, but there are a few things that we both love dearly, even if they are for different reasons. I think we both agree that probably one of the best and most entertaining but I think probably the best example of a really, really well-designed and wildly entertaining game that's designed for a specific game world is Feng Shui.
Oh yeah, Feng Shui is great for what it is. It's very specifically designed for sort of a Hong Kong action flick.
Yep.
It says it right on the cover.
The action movie RPG. I mean.
Yes, and it's got a very specific world that it plays into and everything, and
yeah, I mean,
yeah, we both love it.
Yeah, you can drag it. You can drag it sort of out of the actual official feng shui world into other generic sort of action movies, but it really shines when you're actually doing the feng shui world. Because of the way some of the XP system ties into that and such.
Right.
But it's one of the best. The mechanics are really solid. It's very simple to learn how to play. There's a whole bunch of different ways you can build characters, despite the fact they're very simple and straightforward and quick to build.
It's remarkably flexible.
Yeah, and as I said, the mechanics are simple yet robust, which is very, very rare.
Yeah, it's like Go.
Yeah.
You'll figure it out in a minute, but it'll take you forever to friggin' master it.
Well, it's not even just that. It's that one of the things I found over the years is a lot of games where they try to go, where would you make the game mechanics very simple so that they don't get in the way. The problem is they end up leaving gigantic holes where you sort of go, okay, what happens here? The GM has to make it up on the spot and you go on, which is fine, but you eventually start creating more and more house rules, and all of a sudden you're playing a different game because you've basically written your own game. The thing about Feng Shui is the rules are very simple, yet they manage to be very comprehensive.
Right. There's what happens here. Well, that would fall under this situation, so according to the rules, this does.
Yep.
Oh, okay. And it'll be consistent from then on.
Yeah, it's really I am amazed to this day how strong mechanically that game is, despite the fact that it's very simple. And is, I think, quite possibly the single best teaching RPG I've seen.
Yes. Because it is so simple and comprehensive.
Yeah, exactly. But it does have the one limitation that if you don't like action movies, you probably won't like the game.
I think it translates relatively well into a more of a comedic tone.
True.
There are plenty of comedic action movies out there also.
Yes. And as an aside, do realize that from a raw mechanic standpoint, it might be the single best game I've seen to replicate the actual feel of the Star Wars movies.
Yeah. It's a shame there isn't a feng shui Star Wars system out there.
Because the base mechanics are so perfect. But at any rate, one other thing I want to touch on is the middle of the scale, because we mentioned there are some games there that a lot of games sort of aren't really on either end. And honestly, as I mentioned, you've got Hero System on the one end for this Universal, and really, I think the best example of a specific system that sort of stands up is Feng Shui at the other end. Although you can adapt it a little bit.
I think a better example, just because of the inflexibility of it, would be Call of Cthulhu or Shadowrun.
Sure, we'll go with that.
Because another anecdote, I briefly played in someone who wanted to run a sword and sorcery game in using the Shadowrun system, but the problem is a lot of the checks and balances against magic are cybernetics and assault cannons. When you remove those and everyone's just using swords and axes or spells, mages are becoming even more of an unbalancing issue.
Boom! Right. So that's a good point, Eric. But then there are the games like Dungeons and Dragons, which look like at first it's a system-specific game. But then you look at it and realize it actually covers a whole lot of different fantasy genres, sort of.
It fits right in the middle.
Now,
you can do Robert E. Howard's Conan in D&D very well. You can do Game of Thrones in D&D really well.
I'd argue that point, but the thing, what D&D does is it does high fantasy well. It doesn't do low fantasy particularly well, in my opinion, but which is why I don't think it does Conan very well. Magic is too reliable and too powerful.
Mm.
But at any rate, and too ubiquitous. But at any rate, that's neither here nor there. But D&D...
Yeah, I did just list two low fantasies, didn't I?
Yeah, you did. I was thinking, I'm not sure those are the ones I'd have chosen. But at any rate, D&D covers a bunch of different. If you look at just the D&D specific settings, you run the gamut from things like the Forgotten Realms, which is sort of classic fantasy, or Greyhawk, classic sort of D&D fantasy. Then you got things like Planescape, which is this weird sort of quasi going between various dimensions from heaven to hell and other weirdness, to the post-apocalyptic Dark Sun, to
right.
the gothic horror of Ravenloft. I mean, this is actually a fairly wide spectrum of styles of game.
And we're not even getting into the third-party world like
Right.
the Iron Kingdoms.
Exactly. So,
which, for those that don't know, is sort of a steampunk
right,
genre.
or Eberron, if you want to stay within their own things, which is not really steampunk; it's magic punk, really, kind of.
Right.
But it's astonishing how widely varied it is. And as much as I'm not a fan of 3.0, it's closer to a universal system than any version of D&D ever has been, because of how flexible the character creation system is, because of the way you multi-class.
Right.
Now, it doesn't balance well when you're doing that, and you can completely break your character doing that, but they were sort of moving into sort of almost a classless system there. Almost. And they've retreated back away from that in 4th edition, and they're doing weird stuff from what I've been hearing.
Retreated screaming from that.
Yeah. Ah! And they're going into weird places from what I've been reading about 5th edition, but that's another topic for another time.
5th edition doesn't exist yet, and it will probably end up mutating to such a point that the original concept of it will not apply anymore.
That's often how games go when they're being designed. So
yeah.
But yeah, D&D does cover a whole bunch of different genres, and it manages to, especially 4th edition, managed to sort of drag in some bits from here and there. Like, it's got that class. They focus very heavily on trying to get the game actually pretty well balanced between the classes, which has always been a bit of a nightmare for a class-based system, especially when you have these wildly different mechanics between non-magic and magic. And
right.
They've done a pretty good job in 4th edition of actually balancing those two.
Which is one of the things I really like about it. One of the things I also like about 4th edition is the tactical form of combat with the map and
right.
menus and everything.
And
being an old war gamer, I like that.
Yeah.
I know a lot of people don't, in fact, hate it. But I'm also going to say that I absolutely despise the skill system in 4th edition.
I can understand that. But I mean, this is we're mostly sort of talking. It's sort of one of those things that 4th edition is this. It's an example of, I think, trying to blend the sort of the best of both the universal and the setting specific games, and they did a pretty good job of sort of blending the strengths without getting too many of the weaknesses of either. It's not perfect by any stretch of the imagination. It's got flaws. And it doesn't really quite achieve what it's trying to do fully, I think. But they managed to come up with what I think is actually a fairly entertaining game. And I like the fact that they tried to do that. And it'll be interesting to see if more game designers going forward do things like that and try to draw elements from the sort of two ends of the spectrum while doing that. I'm
also going to point out that I'm a weirdo and that I like both 3.5 and 4th. So
I know
I don't really play either.
I know several people who are that way also, and my main objections to 3.0 and 3.5 are from the DM seat more than the player seat.
Right, and I just don't DM very often because
it's a lot of work.
It's a lot of work. I'm a fundamentally lazy person.
So yeah, I think it'll be interesting to see going forward if the people who are designing system-specific worlds draw on elements from the generic systems out there. I know that some have over the years, but it'll be interesting to see how things keep adapting as they go forward.
What I'm also sort of interested in seeing in further development of tabletop RPGs is how much they're going to draw from MMOs. Because it's both the greatest strength and greatest weakness of 4th Ed is that it draws a lot of concept from MMOs.
Yep.
It's a weakness in that, let's face facts, you're not going to make up your own class in 4th Ed. It's just not going to happen.
Pretty much no.
Too much work. And nigh impossible to balance. What was relatively possible in, say, 3 or 3.5. Still a lot of work, but not impossible.
Right. Yeah. It was hard. Most of what I saw in 3.5, 3.3.5 in terms of design were people, home design, were people designing prestige classes more than anything else.
Right. I'm also thinking again, going to the third party game worlds, in particular, again, Iron Kingdoms, because I love that one. They had things like gun mages.
Right.
Which you'll never see in 4.0, probably because they're copyrighted by Privateer Press. But
right. So, do you have any particular? So, do you actually have a preference for the sort of at either end of the spectrum?
I tend to prefer specific systems and more specialized systems, because when you're playing in a specific world, it's nice to have the mechanics directly represent that.
Okay.
But at the same time, Universal, if there isn't a specific world you're going in for, or you have your own world that you want to set the players loose in, a generic system works great for that.
Yeah. Since I game master more often than not, and I love doing world design, I think that's part of the reason I do tend to prefer the Universal systems.
Mm.
So that's sort of my personal preference. I also really like the attention to detail in the mechanics, and balancing them.
Right. Well, I prefer the attention to detail to the game world and the fluff and the typically gigantic wealth of knowledge that you can't get from just one person unless they've spent decades on it.
Right. Exactly. So I think that sort of covers our sort of preferences on that. Do you have any closing thoughts on the topic, Eric?
I like RPGs.
Well, yeah. My closing thoughts on sort of the topic of generic versus universal is, I don't think that either is particularly better than the other. I think there are places for both out there, I forgot to mention I forgot one little detail which I think I do want to talk about very quickly before we finish this off. Sort of the closing thoughts is that let's finish this off. I don't think either one of them are better, and the interesting thing is even the most universal of universal systems has things they don't do well. The interesting thing about both GURPS and in Hero is that they have little things they don't do as well as the other. GURPS doesn't do super cinematic combat nearly as well as Hero System does.
Right.
And Hero System doesn't do gritty realism quite as well as GURPS does. That's largely...
Although we made a try at it with your Hero Fantasy game.
Yeah. Yeah. Of course you guys did. Damn you and Aaron. Damn you and Chris. But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, is that Hero... It stems from what their roots were. Hero grew out of what was actually a specific system. It grew out of a superhero RPG. Whereas GURPS was built from the keel out to do modern, sort of a spectrum of modern style, so setting in the modern day or sci-fi or low fantasy RPGs.
Mm.
So they came from different starting points, which means they have different strengths and relative things that they do well, do better than the other. I mean, as I said, GURPS handles gritty realism skills a little bit better, whereas Hero System, as I said, is better doing cinematics and is more flexible in what you can do with character design. Whereas the other end of the spectrum, not all, even the best, system-specific thing doesn't, especially if they're doing something like if they're basing it on a license, doesn't always capture the feel of the game world perfectly for everybody.
This is true. Looking at you, Mech Warrior.
Yeah. Well, Mech Warrior fails on numerous different levels. Not the least of which is, wow, the mechanics of this are terrible. And wow, it doesn't really feel Battletech-y. And wow, you just failed at almost every level you can fail on as an RPG. Well done. Oh, God. But yeah, so again, I don't think either type of game is inherently better than the other. And I think they both have roles and niches within the spectrum of RPGs, and I'm glad both exist. Anything else, Eric?
Yeah, you pretty much covered it all. I mean, there are damn good reasons for both to exist, and again, I am happy they both exist. Although I will admit that when GURPS first came out, I recoiled slightly and went, generic. Why would I do that when I had all these specific systems out there?
And now that you've actually played more than a few GURPS games with me,
Oh, not just with you.
I know. But you played a few.
Of GURPS existing.
Yeah. It's like, oh, that's why it exists. Huh.
Yeah.
All right. So that covers our thoughts on the generic versus specific system. From here, I think we're going to go on to Q&A. Unfortunately, I don't think we have any questions in our mailbox just yet. So we're opening up the questions to the chat. So if anyone in the chat has questions, now would be an excellent time to start throwing them at us. Okay, how to get get friends interested in modern RPG setting with some fantasy/magic thrown in, a la Dresden Files, that uses the fudge system. This is from Kazi. Well,
I don't know anything about the fudge system, so I can't speak for that. But I can say, holy crap, Dresden Files! Just give them the books. Seriously, those are great books, and anyone that doesn't like them has no soul.
Yeah. Also, I actually, if I remember correctly, the Dresden Files RPG actually basically uses fudge. I think the base mechanics are drawn from the fudge system. So,
I'm now remembering that there is a Dresden Files RPG out there, and I know nothing about it. So,
our mutual friend Leland likes it a lot, and it does use fudge. So there we go.
Aha.
But how to get someone interested in that? Are they interested in RPGs? If they are, I guess Eric's right. If the hurdle is more getting interested in the game world, give them the first book. I mean, or lend them your copy and have them read it. And if
they're great. They're great books and a great world that they built for it.
Okay, so they play Pathfinder and Warhammer 40K, minis and RPGs. Okay, I see what you're saying. Honestly, just offer to run a one-shot. Well, that's the problem with Dresden Files. It's not really well suited to one-shots. I guess, basically, try to set up something with using fudge itself, the basic fudge thing. Just sort of come up with a one-shot adventure. Just say, hey, guys, I got a little one-shot I want to run some Friday night. Let's all get together and play it. And if you really like it, we can move into an actual campaign. But if you don't like it, we'll just move on and do something else. But I want you guys to give it a shot.
A TV series based on the Dresden Files that was out for a little while that changed a couple things, but did for example, Harry's not as much of a dick as he should have been. That might be good to get them interested in the world, because I don't remember much about the series, honestly, but it's a possibility. I'm trying to think of other things that you could do that involves modern day magic stuff. And
yeah, I mean, there's several things.
Drawing a blank. I know it's out there.
Yeah, but yeah, honestly, I think between getting them interested in the books or the show, and as I said, just run a one shot with a slightly more universal system than the Dresden File things. Don't go full on into the Dresden Files RPG, but do maybe a Dresden Files light version, and just set up a one shot and say, look, guys, I've got this idea for a one shot. I'd love it if you guys would play. Just give it a shot, and if you enjoy it, we can move it into a full time campaign. And if you don't like it, then you don't like it, and we don't have to. We won't keep playing it. But I'd be interested to see what you guys think of it.
Well, if Dresden Files is based heavily on fudge, why not just run a one-shot using fudge in a similar world? And if they like it, then you can introduce them to the actual thing.
Yep. That'd be my take on it. I like the idea of I've actually had a fair bit of success doing that over the years. So, okay, if people are on the fence about it, run a one-shot, and
yeah, that's how you got us hooked on Feng Shui.
I have no idea what you're talking about. Because if I remember correctly, some of you were a little bit skeptical about it. I know Roach was skeptical. And he ended up loving that game.
Yeah. He had lots of fun in that game. We all did.
All right, any other questions, folks?
I have a question.
You have a question?
Does 40K still suck? I haven't played since 3rd edition. I remember the kind of terrible balance between the armies that I had at the time. But every once in a while, I look over at my Space Orc Speed Freaks, and I get all misty-eyed.
Eric, do you know when the last time I played 40K was?
You were still in 2nd edition, wasn't it?
No. Eric, we played each other in 3rd edition.
Did we? I don't remember.
You don't remember the small 1,000-point game we played?
Oh, right.
My Marines, your Speed Freaks. It basically ended up with your war boss and my chaplain, and almost nothing else left.
Yes.
I think I won by like
games ended up like that.
I think I won by like a victory point.
Yeah.
Yeah, I haven't played 40K since 3rd edition either, so I really can't answer that. Well, it's looking like there really aren't much else in the way of questions from the chat today. Fortunately, we actually didn't have a lot of time for questions. So unless anyone has any other questions, I guess we'll wrap things up here. All right. From there, I think we'll wrap things up for now.
Yep.
Okay. So that's all we have time for today. If you have comments on the show or would like to have your questions answered during the Q&A portion of the show, please feel free to either comment on the blog post where you find the recording of this, or you can send an email to our email address, surlygrognards@yahoo.com, and we'll try to get your questions in a future show. You can find me on Twitter at MechaGM or on Facebook or Google Plus as Peter Bowman. You can find Eric's work on the webcomic Boston Arcanum, which is located at bostonarcanum.com. So I'm Peter Bowman, and for my co-host here, Eric Carlson, I wish all of you a good night and hope you enjoy the show. Say good night, Eric.
Good night, guys. I have no internet presence.
Well, you work on the webcomic, so there you go.
Yeah, I work on the webcomic, but that's it.
But yeah, good night, guys. I hope you all enjoyed, and we'll see you either maybe next week, maybe the week after. Not sure yet what we're going to talk about, but I will be sure to post it in one of those locations when I do. But again, thank you all, and have a good night, guys. Take care.
Good night, humans.